But boxing is very limited in its arsenal, but it has a specialty, and it has a specialty that very few people understand until they study the art of boxing.
The art of fighting without fighting? Show me some of it.
Hi there everybody, Michael Valenti here with the School of Self-Defense in Indianapolis. And in today's video, I'm going to be answering a viewer question in which they ask which art should they learn first for self-defense, the art of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu or the art of boxing. Now, of course, if you are new to this channel, be sure to click the subscribe button, click the thumbs up button, and hit that little bell so that you can get notified anytime I release a new video. And if you live too far from Indianapolis to train with me in person, I now have the entire first rank of my school online to train at home with a friend. That's at Kenpo360.com, where you can find the essential techniques for survival. That's at Kenpo360.com. So this viewer asks a simple question about which should they start with when it comes to self-defense. Should they learn Brazilian Jiu Jitsu first, or should they learn boxing first? Like, what's the better foundation for self-defense? And this is a really interesting question because these are two arts that specialize, but one of them specializes in something that you probably aren't thinking about when you think about them. So let's get into it. So we have Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which for all intents and purposes is a specialty in ground fighting, very specifically ground fighting. And I would say that even more so, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu's real specialty, what it has over other grappling arts, is the ability to win from extremely vulnerable positions. Then you have boxing that specializes in punching. But boxing is very limited in its arsenal, but it has a specialty, and it has a specialty that very few people understand until they study the art of boxing. So let's first look at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and kind of look at the pros and cons. For starters, the pros are pretty simple, that if a fight is left completely uninterrupted, there's a very high likelihood that the two people will end up on the ground. Moreover, if you're talking about self-defense, where you're fighting someone who's bigger, stronger, and more athletic than you, the chances of you not only ending up on the ground, but ending up on your back in a vulnerable position are extremely high. And if we're looking at something like women's self-defense, then being on your back in a vulnerable position is where the bad guy wants to take you in the first place. So the pros there of that ground fighting for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is extremely high. But what's the downsides of starting with Brazilian Jiu Jitsu? Well, for me, it kind of stems to just one really huge issue, one glaring issue. Now, I'm speaking about this from the context of somebody who lives in the American Midwest. So of course, your experience may differ. But what I experience is that the majority of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu practitioners don't really understand punches and how to stay safe from punches, how to stay safe in any striking situation whatsoever. And that stems from the fact that the majority of the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu schools in my area are sports-based. And I have friends who train in Chicago, and friends who train in California, and friends who train in Florida, and they all kind of give me the same story, that the BJJ schools there are far more concerned with the sport of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu than really any of the self-defense aspects of the art, which is awesome. There's nothing wrong with playing the sport, but that also does mean that you may be training and developing, and more importantly, prioritizing skills that have no application to self-defense, or even worse, skills that actually are going to be a detriment to your self-defense. The other area that a lot of BJJ schools lack is really understanding any sort of like takedowns. There are, of course, some really basics that the BJJ schools will have. They'll usually have a double leg and a single leg and maybe an ankle pick. And then, then they might have one or two throws from judo, like maybe an outside reap and a hip toss. But having a deep understanding of takedowns, most BJJ schools I've come across don't seem to have that. As a matter of fact, the first Brazilian Jiu Jitsu school I ever trained at was a Pedro Saura school, which was very self-defense oriented. But when we would roll, basically everyone would just start on their knees. Like we would just pretend that like the takedown didn't exist. We would just start on our knees and kind of go from there. Now, of course, like I said, everyone's experiences are going to be unique to themselves. But I don't really want to hold the throw thing against BJJ because boxing obviously doesn't have much of a takedown skill either. So in the BJJ corner, we have that they are good at ground fighting, which is very likely to happen in a self-defense situation. And more importantly, they're experts at winning from vulnerable positions, which is basically self-defense. The downside of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is the fact that they don't really have much of a punch defense game. And so, yeah, you end up, just getting hit. Okay, so that's enough of BJJ. Let's take a look at boxing, pros and cons. I'm actually gonna start with the cons of boxing. And the cons of boxing should be like instantly obvious. Their arsenal is insanely limited. Obviously, in a self-defense situation, you want to use every tool at your disposal to stay safe. And limiting yourself to strikes that land on the front of your hand or the front of your fist, I mean, it's almost silly, in a self-defense scenario, especially if you're considering the fact that the hand itself is extremely fragile. One of the things that we oftentimes don't talk about in the martial arts world, and that's because we play sports so much, is the whole reason why we wear gloves. The amateur or the uninitiated will probably think that we put gloves on to protect our opponent, but that's not the case at all. We put gloves on to protect ourselves. That in a boxing competition, what they'll do is they put hand wraps on, and the kind of hand wraps that we put on in the actual fights are damn near like a cast. It's very, very dense. And the whole point of the hand wrap is to protect your knuckles from breaking and prevent your wrist from bending on impact. So it's like meant to stabilize. And then you put the glove on top of it. And that thick glove is further meant to help protect your knuckles and stabilize your wrist. So if you are never training and hitting without that glove on, which in boxing, why would you? You don't really understand how to throw a punch safely. And even if you understand how to throw a punch safely, you probably haven't put in the appropriate amount of conditioning so that your hand can take it. People who study arts like Kenpo and karate and kung fu, we all condition our hands to be able to take the impact. Whether it's working a wall bag in Wing Chun or the Makiwara board in karate, we are building up the bone density and the wrist strength to be able to throw a hard punch without breaking our hand. And by far, the hardest punchers I've ever played with have been boxers. And if you punch really hard, one thing to understand is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So when you hit someone, it's that some of that force is coming back to your hand. And you can't even say, well, if someone's a really good boxer, that won't happen, because arguably one of the best boxers of all time, Floyd Mayweather, notoriously breaks his hands in most of his fights. So for the cons for boxing, we have the fact that their arsenal is very limited, that they only really have punches. So we're ignoring things like kicks, knees, elbows, palm strikes, and of course, the eye jab. And then the other downside is that the tools of boxing really require a considerable amount of more thought once you take the glove off. So what's the positive side of boxing? And this is where I was talking about earlier in the video, when I said one of these arts appear to specialize in one thing, but actually specialize in something else. What boxing appears to specialize in is punching. And they do. They have that skill. But what boxing really specializes in, its real secret sauce, is footwork. Footwork is by far the greatest asset any boxer has in a fight. Understanding range, how to stay out of punching range, how to bridge the gap to punching range, how to move around your opponent safely, how to get your tools to your opponents without getting hit by their tools. That is the real skill of any boxer. When we talk about the greatest boxers of all time, we think about Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson and Manny Pacquiao. We're talking about people who their footwork was insanely advanced. And one of the things we neglect, especially as an amateur in the martial arts world, is how important footwork actually is to our overall game. You can have the hardest punch in the world, but if you don't have the wheels to get you there, then it doesn't matter. I would argue that footwork is every bit as important as how you punch or as you kick, or maybe even more important. So even though I have this deep passion and love for Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's something that I've been practicing my whole life and I will plan to practice till the day I die, BJJ lacks that understanding of punch protection, that footwork that you're going to get from boxing. Now, as I've said many times in past videos, that if a fight goes completely uninterrupted, there's a very high likelihood that that fight will end up on the ground. But let's go ahead and face it. Basically all fights start standing up. And so understanding the footwork of boxing combined with the profoundly powerful tools of boxing will probably give you the best return on investment. And there's nothing saying that you can't study boxing and then get into Kenpo or get into Jiu-Jitsu or Judo and kind of fill in the rest of the gaps. But if I were to choose just one art to start with between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing, yeah, I would go with boxing, simply because of that footwork will keep you safe. The footwork of boxing is the foundation of our footwork in my school. The only real difference is instead of hitting with jabs, we're gonna hit with more eye jabs. And instead of hitting crosses, we're gonna hit palm strikes and elbows. That's what really makes Kenpo 360 Kenpo 360. And of course, if you're interested in learning Kenpo 360 and you don't live in the Indianapolis area, as I stated earlier in the video, you can do that on our website, kenpo360.com, where you can learn the essential techniques for survival at kenpo360.com. There's a lot of times where people will comment on my videos having not watched the whole thing. So to let me know that you made it to the end, include the phrase punch out somewhere in your comment to me, and then you and I will know you made it to the end. And of course, if you did make it to the end of the video, you're clearly enjoying the video. So if you haven't subscribed yet, what's wrong with you? Click that subscribe button, click the thumbs up button, and hit that little bell so you can get notified anytime I release a new video. So until next time, everybody, I'm Michael Valenti with the School of Self-Defense. Fight on.